High above a small mountain town, a Navy SEAL Special Operations soldier lives alone in an isolated cabin. Day after day, the only job is watching the valley from the ridgeline. Then a blizzard, the worst in 20 years, crashes into the slope like a warning bell no one can mute. A German shepherd suddenly stops, ears pinned low, then yanks hard toward a safe hillside that doesn't feel safe at all. A hollow thud booms beneath the snow. A thin crack appears. The whole mountain seems to hold its breath. Down in town, people trust weather apps and shrug, until an urgent call forces a choice: evacuate or gamble everything. And in the thick white haze, fresh sawdust and truck tracks whisper the truth. This isn't just nature. Someone has stripped the forest bare. Where are you watching from? Like, comment, and subscribe to follow what happens next. Morning over the northern Rockies carried a bright, hard clarity, as if the world had been scrubbed clean with ice and patience. The pine forest below Granite Crown stood dark and solemn, old green spires stitched into the mountain's ribs, while snow on the upper slopes glittered like salt thrown over a feast meant for gods who preferred silence. Down in the valley, the small town of Lantern Gulch looked harmless and warm, a handful of roofs and chimneys cupped in the bowl of the earth, its streets thin as pencil lines, its windows catching sunlight like little lanterns keeping a promise. Above it all, set back from the most violent gusts and not foolish enough to perch on the absolute peak, a legal off-grid log cabin clung to the ridgeline in the place where wind spoke loud, but roads still made sense. The cabin belonged to Merrick Shaw, a 40-year-old retired Navy SEAL with the build of a man who had once been carved by command and routine, broad-shouldered, about 6'1", strong in a practical way, like steel that had learned to bend without breaking. His face carried that American masculine sharpness people wrote poems about and then regretted. An angular jaw, high cheekbones, a clean-shaven chin that looked like it had never tolerated excuses. His hair was dark brown, always kept in a neat undercut, always clean because some habits didn't die just because the war ended. His eyes were blue-gray, deep and watchful, the color of winter river stone, and they held a quiet sadness that didn't ask to be fixed. A faint scar crossed near his wrist from an old training mishap, and his left knee sometimes tightened when he turned too fast, a small price the body collected long after the mind had begged for a receipt. He spoke little, not because he lacked words, but because he'd once learned how quickly words could turn into funerals, and when he did speak, his humor came dry and understated, the kind that arrived like a match in cold hands. He lived alone by choice, though alone was never the full truth, because beside him moved a 5-year-old male German shepherd named Bracken, large and powerful at around 88 pounds, black and tan with a darker back than most, as if the night had leaned on him and left a permanent shadow. Bracken's ears stood upright like radar dishes that could hear a thought before it became sound. His amber-brown eyes were so deep they seemed to hold weather in them, and his chest was broad, his body muscled, the stance proud and work-trained. Only the smallest imperfection betrayed history. A slight, persistent limp in his left front paw. A gentle hitch that appeared when he climbed or shifted pace. The kind of injury that never fully leaves, only learns to live politely. Around Merrick's cabin hung the tools of a man who believed in preparation the way some people believed in prayer. Solar panels angled toward the thin winter sun, a backup generator sheltered from drifts, a water cistern, stacked firewood, emergency radio, maps pinned in neat squares, and a shovel always leaning where it could be grabbed without thinking. On Bracken's collar dangled a scorched piece of old K9 harness, blackened at the edges, preserved like a relic. Not magic, not a charm, just memory carried forward because some grief refuses to stay buried. The town called Merrick an oddball, the quiet hermit on Granite Crown, the ridgeline weirdo, who came down for supplies and vanished again like a period at the end of a sentence. But the name wasn't cruel so much as puzzled. Lantern Gulch simply didn't know what to do with a man who didn't perform his pain in public. 2 days before the storm, Merrick drove his mud-splattered truck into town on a clear blue afternoon that made winter look deceptively gentle. He moved through aisles of canned food and batteries with the efficiency of someone who'd once packed for missions where mistakes cost lives, and Bracken stayed close, calm but alert, nails clicking lightly on the floor, nose sampling the air like a scientist with a thesis in scent. June Halverson, the owner of the general store, watched them from behind the counter. June was in her late 60s, silver hair twisted into a tidy bun, round glasses perched low on her nose, cheeks pink from the cold, and she wore the same olive sweater and brown apron every day, as if dressing differently might confuse the town's memories. She had the warm, teasing manner of a woman who had seen enough winters to stop fearing them, and her eyes were sharp in the way only kind people can afford to be. "Stocking up again, Merrick?" she asked, voice light, as if she were talking about cookies instead of catastrophe. Merrick nodded once, his expression reserved, and gave a small shrug that said, "I'd rather have it and not need it." Bracken, usually steady as a statue, paused at the front window and stared out at the sky as if it had whispered an insult. His ears angled forward, his chest tightened. He let out a low, uncertain huff. June followed his gaze and sighed. "Weather app says we're getting the biggest blizzard in 20 years, she said, half amused, half uneasy. "Folks think the phone will save them. You think it will?" Merrick's mouth tilted. Almost a smile. Almost not. "Phones are good at telling you what's already decided," he said, voice quiet, trimmed of unnecessary syllables. "They're not great at telling you what the mountain is thinking." June snorted, the sound of humor fighting anxiety and winning by a hair. "Well, if the mountain starts texting, tell it to shop local." Merrick paid, loaded supplies, and left with Bracken at his side. And for a moment, June watched them go with an expression that looked like respect, wearing the disguise of skepticism. Outside, as Merrick crossed the parking lot, the air felt too clean, too still, the kind of calm that makes seasoned people uncomfortable. Bracken stopped again, nose up, breathing slow, then whined, once sharp and brief like a warning bell. Merrick rested a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the heat under thick fur, and the scorched harness scrap knocked softly against the collar. "Yeah," Merrick murmured, not to the dog exactly, but to the world. "I hear it too." Back at the cabin, Merrick checked the barometer, scanned the emergency frequencies, and walked the perimeter, boots crunching in snow that squeaked under pressure. The sun stayed bright, almost cheerful, as if it hadn't heard the forecast. That brightness made everything look less like sorrow and more like clean paper, waiting for a new sentence. Merrick hated that he could still be fooled by beauty. He'd learned long ago that the prettiest days could be the most dangerous because they made people careless. He had once trusted calm skies and paid for it, and though he never talked about that particular day, it lived in the way he counted batteries and tested radio ranges. When dusk came, he lit the stove, checked the generator again, and watched Bracken pace from window to window with a restlessness that was not fear, but focus, as if the dog were listening to a language made of pressure and distance. Merrick tried to read a book, but his eyes kept lifting toward the ridgeline beyond the glass, toward that eastern slope where snow tended to load when the wind came from the west. He told himself it was routine. Winter always threatened, mountains always bragged. Yet his chest held a stubborn knot that didn't loosen. The rehook came not as a dramatic explosion, but as a small, wrong detail that made Merrick's instincts stand at attention. Near midnight, a gust rolled over Granite Crown, and then stopped so abruptly the silence felt heavy, like a door shut in a hallway. Bracken froze mid-step, head tilted, ears locked forward. His amber eyes widened, not in panic but in recognition, and then he moved to Merrick's side and pressed his paw against Merrick's scarred wrist, firm and insistent, as if anchoring him to the present. Then Bracken turned, walked to the cabin door, and sat perfectly still, refusing to lie down, staring at the seam under the frame where cold air leaked in. He didn't bark, he didn't whine, he simply waited, like a sentry who had seen something coming and decided words would be wasted. Merrick felt the hair lift on his own arms. Not superstition, not magic, just the ancient, practical part of him that knew the difference between ordinary quiet and the kind of quiet that comes before a collapse. He grabbed his headlamp, clipped the radio to his vest, and stepped outside with Bracken, breath rising in pale clouds, the stars sharp as nails. The world looked unchanged, yet it felt different, as though the mountain had taken a slow, careful inhale. They moved along the ridgeline trail towards the eastern slope, the snow underfoot firm but suspiciously smooth in places, wind sculpted into gentle pillows that hid their weight like lies. Merrick's mind ran in calm, disciplined lanes. Wind direction, last snowfall, temperature swing, slope angle, sun exposure. Bracken walked ahead, leash slack but purposeful, nostrils flaring, scanning the surface with the intensity of a medic reading skin. Halfway down the traverse, Bracken stopped so hard the leash went taut. His ears snapped forward, his body stiffened, and he leaned backward as if pulling Merrick away from an invisible edge. Merrick followed the dog's line of sight and saw it. A thin, jagged fracture running across the snowpack like a hairline crack in porcelain. A crown crack. Small, yes, but honest. The kind of small truth that becomes a large tragedy if ignored. Merrick crouched and listened. At first, there was only the faint hiss of wind higher up. Then came the sound, soft, startling, unmistakable, a deep whoomph that traveled through the snow as if the mountain had let out a breath it had been holding. Bracken's hackles rose, his lips tightened over teeth, not in aggression, but in warning. Merrick felt the vibration through his boots and into his bones. Aji. And for a moment old memories tried to climb his throat, collapsing ceilings, sand turning to smoke, the split second when the body realizes it is not in control. He swallowed hard, forcing his breathing slow. Fear, he reminded himself, is useful only when it obeys. He pulled out his phone, not for comfort, not for faith, but for the camera and the GPS, and took clear photos of the crack and the drift lines. He measured the slope angle with practiced eyes, noted the aspect, and checked the wind-loaded pockets where snow had piled thick like hidden debt. He marked the coordinates, traced the probable slide path in his mind, and imagined the town below. Lantern Gulch's roads, its school, its little church, the cluster of homes near the low gullies where an avalanche could funnel like anger into a narrow street. He thought of June Halverson's joking voice and the way her eyes had softened when she looked at Bracken. He thought of how people trusted weather apps the way children trust bedtime stories, believing the monster will stay in the book. Merrick's jaw tightened. He did not allow himself the luxury of panic. He allowed himself only precision. Bracken stood close, shoulder brushing Merrick's knee, amber eyes fixed on the slope as if memorizing it. The scorched harness scrap tapped quietly against his collar in the wind, a small, steady sound like a metronome for courage. Merrick reached out and let his fingers sink into the thick fur at Bracken's neck. "Good catch," he whispered, as if praise could be an offering to the instinct that kept them alive. The dog's ears flicked back briefly, acknowledging him, then returned forward, listening again to the invisible weight shifting above. In that bright, cold night, with the storm still hours away and the snow already speaking in warning syllables, Merrick Shaw did what he had always done when the world tried to become chaos. He recorded the truth, piece by piece, and prepared to act before the small thing could become the big thing. Merrick Shaw did not sleep after the whoomph. He returned to the cabin with Bracken moving at his heel, both of them carrying the kind of alertness that makes even lamplight feel too loud. Inside, the stove ticked softly, and the solar battery monitor blinked like a patient heartbeat. But Merrick's mind stayed out on that eastern slope where the snow had confessed its weakness. He laid out what he'd gathered, the way other men laid out prayers. Photos of the crown crack, GPS coordinates, a quick sketch of the runout path, wind notes, temperature drop, slope aspect, small facts that, together, formed a blade. Bracken sat beside the table, head slightly lowered, amber eyes fixed on Merrick's hands, as if the dog understood that this was the moment when a warning either became action or became regret. When Merrick finally keyed his radio, his voice came steady, trimmed of drama. He had learned in other mountains, far away, that panic makes people deaf. Evidence makes them listen. The county's emergency frequency answered with static and then a tired voice. "This is Gallatin Ridge Emergency," the dispatcher said. "State your traffic." Merrick gave his name and location, then spoke slowly, delivering coordinates and observations like a medic reading vitals. Crown crack on an east-facing slope below Granite Crown. Audible settling whoomph, wind loading from the west. Drifts deeper than normal. Temperature falling fast. Blizzard forecast pushing more weight into an already unstable slab. He asked for the on-call emergency manager, and after a pause, a new voice came on. Female, clipped, practiced calm. "This is Tessa Rowland," she said, "County Emergency Manager. Talk to me." Tessa Rowland sounded like a woman built for long nights. In her mid-40s, she carried her authority without theatrics, the way mountains carried their height. Merrick had seen her once in town. Tall, athletic, hair pulled into a tight, no-nonsense bun, skin weathered by winters and fluorescent offices alike, and eyes that didn't blink much when people tried to frighten her with worst-case scenarios. She had the manner of someone who'd learned, likely the hard way, that being kind and being firm were not opposites. Merrick relayed everything again, added the photos he could transmit by satellite and the GPS pin, and then, because evidence sometimes needed translation, he gave a plain sentence meant for human hearts. "If that slope goes, it funnels into the lower ridge neighborhoods. It won't be slow." There was a silence on the line, not disbelief exactly, but calculation. Tessa asked questions like a lock testing a key. Exact aspect? Slope angle? Any recent tree fall? Any signs of warming crust? Merrick answered without pride. He did not say, "Trust me, I'm a SEAL." He said, "Here's what the mountain said, and here's what I measured." At the end, Tessa exhaled once. "We're activating a risk advisory," Taushid said. "Not an evacuation order yet. Advisory first. Sheriff's Office, Public Works, and the town coordinator will be looped in. Stay available." Merrick looked at Bracken. The dog's ears flicked, as if he could hear that the world below had shifted into motion. By dawn, Lantern Gulch began doing the thing towns do when fear arrives, it argued. The town coordinator, a man named Martin Keene, called an emergency meeting at the community hall beside the little church, and the hall filled with boot-stomp snow and breathy impatience. Martin Keene was in his early 50s, average height, thick around the middle from too many desk lunches and too many winters, with a neatly trimmed beard that made him look more confident than he felt. He wore a padded jacket that had seen better decades, and his face carried the strained politeness of someone who spent his life trying to keep everybody calm while the world kept trying to set itself on fire. He had been elected because he was steady, not because he was bold. And today, boldness was what the day demanded. Merrick stood at the back, quiet, not because he wanted attention, but because he did not want to steal the room's oxygen. Bracken lay at his boots, vigilant but controlled, a working dog in a town full of people who weren't used to animals that looked like they had opinions. June Halverson sat in the second row, glasses on, arms crossed, a thermos clutched like a tiny shield. Tessa Rowland stood near the front with maps and a laptop, calm as granite. When Martin introduced Merrick, a low murmur rose, some curiosity, some skepticism. A man near the aisle whispered loud enough to be heard, "The Ridge Hermit says the mountain's mad." A few people chuckled, the sound thin and nervous. Tessa didn't smile. She projected Merrick's photos onto the wall, the hairline crown crack, the drift patterns, the topography overlay, showing the run-out path toward the Lower Ridge neighborhood, Cedar Hollow, where small homes sat tucked like children under a blanket. "This isn't folklore," she said. "This is a documented instability pattern, and we're about to get heavy snow and high winds. We're not waiting for confirmation by tragedy." Martin cleared his throat. "So," he said carefully, "we're recommending temporary evacuation for Cedar Hollow and the Lower Ridge Zone, shelter at the church gym and the high school. Transportation assistance for anyone who needs it. This is a precaution." Precaution, of course, is a word that makes some people angry because it sounds like inconvenience. One woman stood up clutching a coffee maker like it was an infant. She was in her late 30s, hair in a messy ponytail, cheeks flushed with righteous frustration, and she said, "I'm not leaving my house for some maybe slide. My grandmother gave me that coffee maker. It's the only thing that works right." Somebody laughed, and June Halverson muttered, "Honey, your grandmother would rather you live long enough to burn another pot." Another man complained about livestock. A teenage boy complained about losing Wi-Fi. An older couple worried about their medication, and a real estate agent worried openly about property values, as if an avalanche cared about resale. Humor surfaced in odd places, the way it does when fear needs a disguise. Merrick didn't argue with them. He spoke once, only when Martin asked him to. "I don't want anyone to panic," Merrick said, voice low, clean-shaven jaw set like a door that wouldn't budge. "But I do want you to respect the slope like you respect fire. You don't wait until it's in your curtains." His blue-gray eyes swept the room, not accusing, just steady. "Take what you need. Leave what you can replace." Bracken lifted his head at the word fire, ears forward, as if remembering something old and bitter. The evacuation advisory became action because Tessa made it practical. She assigned zones, set checklists, called State Highway for road control, asked Public Works to stage plows and loaders, and sent a deputy and a volunteer team to knock on doors in Cedar Hollow. The church opened its gym, bright lights, folding cots, soup simmering in a huge pot, while the high school set up a second shelter with blankets and charging stations. Martin Keene moved through the hall like a man trying to keep plates spinning, sweating under his winter jacket. Merrick helped quietly, loading someone's suitcase into a truck, carrying oxygen tanks for an elderly man, showing a young couple how to turn off water lines so pipes wouldn't burst. He didn't pose as a hero. He looked like a guy who happened to know what mattered in a crisis. Then Bracken did something that made Merrick's spine tighten. As they moved along the edge of town toward the road that led back to Granite Crown, the dog stopped suddenly and swung his head toward the tree line. His nostrils flared. His ears stiffened. He did not bark. He did not whine. He did the thing he'd done at the cabin door: stillness, insistence, focus. Merrick followed the dog's gaze and caught it, faint but wrong. The sharp smell of fresh sawdust carried on wind that should have been too cold for such sweetness. Under it, a harsher odor, diesel, machine oil, like a mechanical fingerprint. The rehook arrived when Bracken padded forward and found tire tracks, wide, heavy tread marks pressed into snow near the Forest Service boundary, partially obscured but unmistakable. Bracken lowered his head and inhaled, then looked back at Merrick with an expression that wasn't animal confusion, but animal certainty. The dog's amber eyes seemed to say, "This isn't just weather, this is people." Merrick crouched, ran a gloved finger along the track edge, and saw where branches had been dragged, snapped clean. The snow around the marks held scattered wood chips that looked almost golden against white. No legitimate logging crew was working here in a storm warning, not this close to the ridge, not with roads about to become impassable. Something had been cut recently, very recently. Merrick's stomach tightened, not with fear this time, but with anger, the quiet kind that forms a plan. He heard his own earlier words echo back like a judgment. Respect the slope like you respect fire. Someone had brought a match into a dry room and pretended it was just for warmth. Merrick took photos again, marked the location, and called Tessa. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been holding the phone. "What now?" she asked. Merrick told her about the tracks, the sawdust, the diesel smell. Tessa went quiet for half a beat, then her voice sharpened. "Copy that," she said. "Send everything. I'll loop in Fish and Wildlife and Forest Service law enforcement. But right now the priority is getting people out. Don't go chasing anyone alone." Merrick's mouth tightened. He didn't like being told what not to do, but he respected competent authority. "Understood," he said. And because he was not made of stone, he added, "Bracken found it. I almost missed the scent." By afternoon, the sky began to darken in a way that made daylight feel borrowed. The wind picked up, swirling loose powder in small spirals, like ghosts practicing their dance. Cedar Hollow's streets emptied. Trucks and SUVs rolled toward shelters. A school bus rattled along with children pressed to windows, watching their own homes as if leaving them might make them vanish. Inside the church gym, people tried to settle into the strange intimacy of shared fear, some making jokes too loud, some staring at nothing, some praying with their eyes open. June Halverson handed out cups of coffee like communion. Martin Keene paced making calls. Tessa Rowland sat over maps and weather feeds, jaw tight, refusing to be surprised by the storm. Merrick returned to the ridge as the first thick clouds swallowed the sun. At the cabin, he checked his gear and set his radio to scan emergency channels. Bracken stood at the window, watching the eastern slope with that unblinking focus. Outside, the tallest pine near the cabin leaned slightly in the rising wind, its branches trembling as if it knew a secret it didn't want to share. Merrick looked down at Lantern Gulch, tiny lights beginning to flicker on, shelters glowing brighter than homes, and felt something unfamiliar shift inside his chest. The town had listened. Not everyone, not happily, but enough. The mountain had spoken. The dog had translated, and for once, people had chosen caution over pride. The blizzard rolled closer like a white curtain being drawn across a stage, and Merrick understood the bitter joke of it. The storm wasn't the only threat. Somewhere in the trees, someone had been cutting and hauling, and greed had left tracks in the snow like a confession. The chapter ended with the wind rising and the world narrowing to essentials: shelter, evidence, and the stubborn loyalty of a dog who could read what humans preferred to ignore. Morning came bright enough to feel almost rude. The sky over the northern Rockies had scrubbed itself clean, and the snow, fresh and wind-smoothed, glittered so hard it made the eyes water. Lantern Gulch looked peaceful from above, as if nothing had tried to bury it the day before. But Merrick Shaw knew better. Peace after disaster often had the manners of a trickster god, smiling while it quietly pointed at what you missed. Bracken padded onto the porch beside him, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a broad chest and a proud working dog stance, black and tan coat darkened along the back like a saddle of ink. The dog's left front paw still carried its faint limp, a small imperfection that made his discipline look even more deliberate. He paused, lifted his head, and tasted the air with his nose the way some people taste coffee, searching for what's real, not what's comforting. The town's emergency frequency had shifted overnight, from urgent triage to post-storm accounting. Roads needed clearing, pipes needed checking. People needed reassurance, and reassurance, Merrick had learned, came in the form of measurable things. We have power at the shelter. The water is safe. No one else is missing. He drove down in his old truck along the mountain access track, careful on the switchbacks, watching the avalanche debris field where snow had piled in ugly, heavy tongues. It was quiet now, but the quiet felt like a stage after the curtain has dropped. Props scattered, footprints everywhere, the truth still in costume. At the county office, Tessa Rowland met him outside the temporary command trailer. She looked like a woman built for storms of all kinds, early 40s, medium height, lean and sharp, with dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense knot, and a face that had learned to show emotion only when it served a purpose. Her coat was practical, her boots scuffed, her eyes alert in the way of someone who sleeps in fractions of hours. "You saved us a catastrophe," she said, not with theatrical gratitude, but with the weight of a ledger balanced. "Now I need you to help us prove why it happened." Captain Rowan Fitch was there too, beard rimed with old frost still stuck in his memory, his rescue jacket unzipped at the collar. He gave Merrick a nod that meant, "I'll trust you again, but don't ask me to break physics." Fitch introduced the third person in the small cluster, Ranger Leah McAdams of the Forest Service. She stepped out of a government SUV like she belonged to the land rather than the vehicle. Mid-30s, tall, athletic, with sun-browned skin and wind-chapped cheeks, strawberry blonde hair tucked under a green cap, and eyes that measured tree lines the way Fitch measured risk. Her uniform looked worn in, not worn out, and her voice carried that mix of patience and steel found in people who explain the same rule to the same kind of man every hunting season. "You're the Ridge guy," she said, "and that's the dog." Bracken stood at Merrick's knee, watching Leah without fear, ears forward, posture polite, but ready. Leah crouched and offered the back of her gloved hand. Bracken sniffed, diesel, pine resin, and a faint trace of coffee, and allowed it. "Good manners," Leah murmured, "and a sharp nose from what I'm hearing." They laid out evidence the way a careful priest lays out relics. Merrick's photos of the crown crack, the coordinates he'd marked, the wind direction and slope angle notes, the timestamps. Fitch added the rescue report and the avalanche path map. Tessa, always thinking in systems, pinned a printed overlay of the neighborhood evacuation boundaries. It was clean, it was clear, and it told the story of a community that had listened. Then Merrick brought up the part that didn't fit the innocent narrative, what Bracken had led him to the day before, the smell of fresh sawdust and oil, the heavy tire tracks where they shouldn't be. Leah's eyes narrowed, the way a horizon narrows when you realize it isn't sky, it's smoke. "If you smelled fresh cut during a blizzard," she said, "somebody was working when they had no business being there." They went out together by late morning, Merrick in his worn field layers, Leah in her Forest Service green, Fitch along to coordinate safety, and Bracken trotting ahead on a long lead. The terrain just outside the avalanche's run-out zone looked bruised. Trees bent, branches snapped, and the snow churned in dull, compacted slabs. But beyond that, where the slope should have been anchored by dense stands of pine, there were gaps that made Merrick's stomach sink. The forest wore absences like missing teeth. Bracken stopped near the edge of one clearing and sniffed hard, head low, tail steady. Then he did something that made Merrick's skin prickle. He walked in a slow arc, almost ceremonial, as if tracing an invisible boundary. He wasn't searching randomly. He was mapping scent. He paused at a churned patch and nosed the snow until it broke crust. Underneath, dark sawdust clung like a stain. Leah crouched beside it and exhaled sharply. "Fresh," she said. "This isn't old logging. This is recent. Someone cut during the storm window or right before it." The connection clicked into place like a snapped buckle. Clear-cut areas change wind behavior, allowing snow to load unevenly. Removal of trees reduces the natural anchors that stabilize the snowpack. Makeshift roads and haul routes slice into slopes, creating smooth plains where snow can shear. An avalanche can be a natural event, but sometimes humans tilt the board and then act surprised when the pieces fall. Fitch stared uphill. "So the mountain didn't just decide to hate us," he said dryly. "Somebody helped it." About a third of the way into their search, the rehook arrived in a small, unsettling miracle of ordinary senses. Bracken abruptly froze, then turned his head toward the ridgeline and gave one low, warning growl, not at a person, not at an animal, but at the air itself. Merrick followed the dog's gaze and saw nothing at first, just sun-bright snow and blue sky. Then a glint, an instant flash of light from far across the slope, like a tiny eye blinking. Binoculars found it, a vehicle, partially hidden behind brush, parked where no vehicle should be. Merrick's chest tightened, not with fear, but with the cold recognition of intent. And then Bracken did the strangest thing. He pressed his scorched K9 harness scrap, kept looped as a charm on his collar, against Merrick's boot, as if offering a reminder. Not magic, not prophecy, just a dog's stubborn, wordless insistence. This matters, and you are not allowed to look away. Merrick felt that old war discipline rise in him, the part that didn't need applause, only purpose. They didn't approach like vigilantes. Leah reminded them of the law in that calm, relentless tone. We document. We report. We don't trespass on a suspected crime scene if we can avoid contaminating it. Merrick nodded. He wasn't interested in a fist fight with shadows. Shadows weren't scared of fists. They were scared of paperwork, photographs, and warrants. Bracken led them along the edge until the scent thickened, diesel oil, chain lubricant, and the sharp tang of freshly split pine. They found the track first, deep, wide tire grooves, packed hard. Then they found the road cut that didn't belong on any county map, a rough corridor carved into the slope, disguised by piled brush. It was the kind of thing greed builds quickly and tries to hide poorly. Leah photographed everything. Tire tread patterns, a broken reflector shard, a length of chain half buried in snow. Merrick added his own images, steady-handed, each frame a clean witness. Fitch called it in, requesting a deputy to secure the perimeter once roads cleared. Tessa's voice crackled over radio, all business. "We're opening a formal case with the state. Leah, send me your coordinates and evidence log." They followed the corridor just far enough to confirm, not enough to blunder. Past a bend, they spotted a crude staging area tucked among trees. Tarps, fuel cans, and stacked logs with fresh, pale cuts that looked obscene against the winter landscape. Someone had been operating here recently. Someone had assumed the storm would cover their tracks, and the avalanche would be blamed on the mountain's temper. The day ended with procedure, evidence uploaded, maps updated, agencies notified. And yet Merrick's cabin did not feel like a safe retreat that night. The sky grew dark early, the cold deepening, and Lantern Gulch's lights below flickered with restored normalcy. Merrick fed Bracken, ran a hand over the dog's thick fur, and listened to the quiet. Somewhere out there, men who thought of trees as money were now thinking of Merrick as a problem. Close to midnight, a pair of headlights swept the ridge road, slow, deliberate, too high for comfort. The beam slid across Merrick's porch like a searching finger, paused on the door, then moved on. A message without words. "We see you." Merrick didn't step outside to shout into the dark. He didn't fire warning shots or do anything that would make him the story instead of the crime. He simply lifted his camera, took one clean photo through the window, and wrote down the time. Bracken stood beside him, silent, muscles tight, ears forward, the kind of stillness that said he could become thunder if asked, but he would wait for Merrick's command. By morning, the town would wake to sunlight again. People would shovel, laugh, complain, and move on. But Merrick understood the new truth the storm had revealed. Sometimes, nature is the coat the crime wears. And the only way to strip it off is patience, evidence, and the stubborn faith that law can be a kind of light. The hunt had begun, not for revenge, but for accountability. The blizzard arrived the way a verdict arrives, without caring whether anyone felt ready. Wind drove snow sideways, turning the world into a white, moving wall, and the temperature dropped so fast it felt like the valley's breath had been stolen. Lantern Gulch, usually a neat little lantern at the bottom of the mountains, became a smudged glow behind a veil. Up on Granite Crown's shoulder, Merrick Shaw watched the weather swallow landmarks one by one. The split pine near his cabin vanished. Then the ridgeline blurred. Then even the nearest slope looked like an empty page being erased as he tried to read it. Bracken, 5 years old, male German shepherd, big and powerful with that dark black saddle across his back and rich tan legs, stood at the door with ears upright and eyes the color of old amber, not afraid but intensely awake. The dog's front left paw carried a faint, permanent hesitation from a past fracture, yet when danger moved, Bracken moved first, as if limp and courage could coexist in the same body. Merrick checked the emergency channel again. Radio chatter came in clipped bursts. Snowplows rerouting, volunteers confirming shelter supplies, deputies reporting which streets had cleared. The advisory had become a real evacuation in everything but the language. And now the storm was arriving to test whether the town's earlier decision had been wisdom or luck. In the church gym, families huddled under blankets, some trying to laugh too loudly, others too quiet to be comforted by soup and coffee. Tessa Rowland kept her composure like a tool that never rusted, coordinating resources and repeating the same truth in different words. The goal was not heroics. The goal was fewer names on a list. Around late afternoon, the mountain made its announcement. It wasn't a cinematic roar at first. It was a subtle shift, a low, hollow sound like a drum struck under snow, the kind of whump Merrick had heard in other places, other years, other lives. Then came the crack, sharp and branching, a white fracture line racing across the upper slope like lightning's quieter cousin. Merrick's stomach tightened, not with surprise, but with the grim satisfaction of being right in the worst possible way. He keyed the radio. "This is Shaw at Granite Crown Shoulder," he said, voice steady, clean-shaven jaw, tight. "Slide is releasing. East face. Confirming movement. Repeat, the slab is moving." Down in the valley, the avalanche became a living thing. Snow did not simply fall, it poured. It surged like a great animal losing patience, a mass of powder and debris charging down a chute that funneled toward Cedar Hollow's lower road. It swallowed a stretch of service route first, one of those thin roads that pretends it's optional until winter reminds you it isn't. A tangle of branches and ripped saplings rode the flow like bones in a current. The air turned into a cloud of white dust that erased distances and muffled sound. And for a heartbeat, the whole world looked unreal, except it was brutally real. But the neighborhood itself, most of it, was empty. That was the miracle. And it wasn't supernatural. It was procedural. It was people listening when they didn't want to. It was cots and soup and grumbling and a woman clutching a coffee maker, all of it suddenly proving its worth. The avalanche pressed close, creeping into the edge of the lower ridge zone, piling into yards like a hungry tide, but the houses had been left behind with their lights off and their doors locked. The mountain had taken space, not lives, not many, not the number it would have taken if Merrick had stayed silent. Still, not many is not none. A call came through the emergency channel, frantic and broken by static. "We've got someone near the road cut. Couldn't get out. Vehicle." Tessa's voice snapped into the channel, sharp and clear. "All units hold the perimeter. No one enters the run-out path until it's declared stable. Fire and rescue stage at the junction." Shaw, If you're safe, can you advise from higher ground? Merrick didn't pretend he was the rescue system. He respected it too much. But he could offer the one thing the system couldn't manufacture in a hurry: intimate reading of that slope. He grabbed his pack, clipped a harness line at the cabin's anchor point, and stepped into the storm with Bracken. The wind hit them like a shove. Snow stung Merrick's cheeks, crawled into seams, tried to blind him. He kept his posture compact, moving with the disciplined economy of a man who had learned to treat weather like an opponent, one you don't taunt, only outlast. Bracken pressed forward, head low, tail steady, paws punching into drifts. They moved along a safe spine Merrick knew well, a ridgelet with mature trees, roots that held the snowpack more reliably. He didn't go charging down into the avalanche path like a mythic lone savior. He stayed above, scanning for secondary slides, listening for that ominous settling sound that meant the mountain was still deciding. He called down to the staging area with measured instructions. Do not approach from the chute. Approach from the west tree line only, where the stand is dense. Watch for hang fire. Mark your return route. At the junction below, the county fire crew arrived in a tracked vehicle, its lights dimmed by blowing snow. A man stepped out. Captain Rowan Fitch, mid-50s, tall and angular, gray beard trimmed close, face weathered into lines that spoke of too many winter calls. He wore a red rescue parka over layered gear, and his eyes carried the calm of someone who'd seen panic kill more effectively than cold. Fitch's voice on the radio was gravel and command. "Copy, Shaw. We'll take west tree line and hold. K9 available?" Merrick glanced at Bracken. The dog's ears flicked at the word K9 like it was his true name. Merrick answered, "K9 is with me, not certified for county ops, but reliable knows." Fitch didn't waste time debating pride. "Understood. Use what you have. Keep him leashed until we assess." They began the search the right way, slowly, safely, with boundaries. The storm tried to erase their footprints behind them, so Merrick and the rescue team set bright markers at intervals, little flags of color against white. Bracken strained forward, eager but controlled, the harness strap cutting a dark line across his thick neck. His amber eyes kept scanning, nose working in short bursts. Scent was hard in wind, but not impossible. The dog moved like a compass needle under invisible magnetic pull. About 30 minutes into the search, Bracken's behavior changed. He stopped abruptly, then circled, ears high, nostrils flaring so hard his whole muzzle seemed to pulse. He let out a short bark, one note, urgent, not frantic. And then he lowered his head and pressed his nose into a drift that looked no different from 1,000 other drifts. Merrick's heart kicked. The rescue crew tightened around the area, careful not to overload the snow. Fitch's voice came through the radio. "What have you got?" Merrick swallowed. "Bracken has something, possible human scent." They worked the drift with shovels and probes, methodical, not frantic. And then the rehook struck, not in a dramatic scream, but in a small, haunting detail. Bracken began pawing at the snow, then suddenly stopped and looked up at Merrick with a strange, almost pleading intensity, as if the dog wanted permission to break the rules of the world. His limp disappeared for that moment, replaced by pure will. Merrick felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, because Bracken wasn't just alerting, he was remembering. The dog's body language was not only "someone is here," but "someone is dying like before." That look, so focused, so deeply sorrowful, hit Merrick like a hand on the chest. It made him think of all the times he'd arrived too late in his former life and all the times he'd sworn he wouldn't again. They uncovered a boot first, then a gloved hand. A man lay pinned in a shallow pocket near the road cut where the avalanche had thrown debris. He was alive, barely, lips blue, eyes wide, with the stunned disbelief of someone who had been sure he was about to vanish. He looked around 30, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, stubble on his jaw, and skin pale from shock. He wore a fluorescent work jacket under a heavy coat. Public works, maybe, or a contractor. Someone who had stayed too long to check one last thing. His name came out in broken breaths when Fitch asked. "Evan?" "Evan Sutter," he managed, voice shredded. Evan's fingers clutched something even as the rescuers freed him, and Merrick noticed it. A cheap handheld radio, cracked at the corner, and a small key ring with a wooden token carved like a pine tree. Evan's eyes kept darting uphill, as if he expected the mountain to come again. Merrick leaned close, voice low, giving Evan the simple anchor of facts. "You're out," he said. "You're breathing. Stay with us." Bracken pressed his muzzle against Evan's shoulder, not rough, not demanding, just present. Evan's eyes filled with tears, and he gave a shaky laugh that sounded like it hurt. "Good dog," he whispered. They got Evan onto the tracked vehicle and back toward the staging area. Behind them the storm continued to rage, but now there was a clear line between chaos and action. A life pulled back from the snow, a route marked, a team working as a team. At the shelter later, word spread fast. How the Ridge Hermit had been right, how the avalanche had come, how only a few had been caught because most had left, how a dog had found a man when machines couldn't see through whiteout. People didn't say oddball with the same flavor anymore. They said Merrick's name carefully, as if it belonged to the town now, not just the Ridge. When Merrick returned to his cabin that night, he stood on the porch and looked down at Lantern Gulch's clustered lights. The valley was still breathing, despite the storm trying to smother it. Orit. Bracken stood beside him, snow crusting his fur, ears upright, posture proud in that quiet, working dog way. Merrick thought of the tire tracks and the sawdust and the diesel smell. The avalanche had been triggered by weather, yes, but weather didn't cut trees or drive heavy trucks into protected boundaries. The mountain had slid, and the town had survived, but the story wasn't finished. The storm had revealed something else, not just a weakness in snowpack, but a weakness in people. And Merrick, newly seen and newly trusted, understood that he was no longer just watching the town from above. He was responsible to it. The wind howled around the cabin like a warning spoken in an ancient tongue, and Bracken, reading the air, stayed close, as if destiny had moved from a whisper into a plan. The next morning, Lantern Gulch woke the way people do after a narrowly avoided funeral, moving, talking, making coffee, but with a new softness behind the eyes. Sunlight spilled over the valley like forgiveness, bright enough to make the storm feel like a story someone else once told. But up on Granite Crown Ridge, Merrick Shaw watched the town from his porch and knew that daylight didn't erase intent. It only revealed it. Bracken stood beside him, 5 years old and heavy-boned, black and tan coat thick against the cold, amber-brown eyes fixed on the tree sign where the headlights had passed the night before. The dog's left front paw carried its faint limp as always, a quiet reminder that damage could heal without ever fully disappearing. Merrick scratched behind Bracken's ear, feeling the warmth through the dense fur, and the dog leaned into the touch. Not needy, just present, like a vow. By noon, the investigation had teeth. Leah McAdams returned with 2 Forest Service law enforcement officers and a county deputy once the main road was plowed enough for official vehicles to move. One of the federal officers, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a wind-chapped face and a clipped, careful manner, introduced himself as Special Agent Owen Klein. He had close-cropped dark hair, a square jaw shaded with the kind of stubble that comes from long days rather than vanity, and eyes that didn't bounce around. They pinned details and held them there. The other was Agent Mara Voss, early 30s, tall and wiry, with brown skin and a sharp, practical expression. Her dark hair was braided tight and tucked under her cap, and she spoke with the steady calm of someone who had learned that panic is contagious. Both wore the same kind of quiet confidence, not loud authority, but procedural gravity. They didn't treat Merrick like a hero or a suspect. They treated him like a witness, and that, strangely, felt like respect. Merrick handed over his photos, the timestamp of the headlights, the coordinates Leah had logged, and a written note of what Bracken had alerted to. Diesel, fresh chain oil, sawdust under crusted snow. Owen listened without interrupting, then nodded once. "We'll secure the site and pursue warrants," he said. "Your job is to keep being accurate." It was the closest thing to a blessing Merrick trusted. By late afternoon, they moved in with method, marking the concealed hall corridor, photographing the staging area, bagging small evidence, reflector shards, a broken zip tie, boot prints pressed into the frozen slush. Mara measured tire tread impressions like she was reading a fingerprint, murmuring the numbers to Leah, who wrote them down. The deputy, a stocky man named Hank Pruitt with a ruddy face and a permanent squint from years of snow glare, hung back with his hand near his radio, eyes on the forest as if it might suddenly grow teeth. Bracken worked like a living compass. He tracked the scent line to where the tarps had been dragged, then circled back, nostrils flaring, and stopped near a cluster of young pines that looked too orderly for wild growth. Merrick watched the dog's posture shift, tail lower, head angled, ears pricked toward a place that sounded like nothing. Bracken pawed once at the snow, then twice, then sat down and stared. Not at Merrick, not at the agents. At the ground itself, as if the earth had told him a secret, and he refused to leave until the humans caught up. Leah knelt where Bracken indicated and brushed snow aside with a gloved hand. Beneath, a fresh cut of plywood, camouflaged under a dusting of white, covered a shallow pit. Owen's expression tightened. "That's not just logging," he said softly, the way you might speak around a sleeping child. "That's concealment." They didn't rip it open. They photographed, flagged, and stepped back, because law, like winter, has rules of friction. You can't sprint over ice and pretend you're still in control. They left the scene secured and documented, and the town did what small towns do. It gathered. Tessa Rowland called an evening meeting at the community hall beside the little church, the same building that had sheltered evacuees during the worst of the storm. The hall smelled of coffee, wet wool, and the faint sweetness of donated casseroles. Comfort food for people who had almost been swallowed whole. Merrick arrived reluctantly, shoulders slightly hunched, like a man stepping into headlights again, Bracken at his side. People turned to look, not with suspicion this time, but with that quiet, awkward gratitude that doesn't know where to place its hands. Tessa stood at the front in a plain parka, hair still in its tight knot, cheeks flushed from running on adrenaline for too many days. She didn't perform. She reported the avalanche path, the evacuation success, the ongoing investigation. Then she did something Merrick didn't expect. She said his name out loud and made it sound like it belonged to the town. "Merrick Shaw's early warning helped us move people before the slope moved first," she said. "And Bracken's tracking helped our teams locate evidence that may explain why the risk was higher than it should have been." The room didn't erupt into worship. It did something more honest. It exhaled. A man in the back, heavy-set, mustached, wearing a flannel shirt too thin for the season, stood and cleared his throat. His name was Carl Dempsey, a hardware store owner whose impatience had been legendary during the evacuation. "I was one of the idiots who complained," Carl admitted, his voice rough with embarrassment. "I didn't want to leave my stuff. My wife did. She dragged me out by the ear. So, I guess I'm here to say thank you. And also, sorry." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, warm and brief. Merrick almost smiled. Almost. Rehook, mid-chapter. After the meeting, as people mingled and the hall softened into chatter, Bracken suddenly pulled hard toward the side door. It wasn't the frantic tug of a dog wanting to run. It was focused, urgent. Merrick followed, confused, and found Bracken staring at a bulletin board near the exit, nose inches from a freshly pinned flyer. The paper showed a crude map of the valley with red circles and handwritten notes. Private ridge access, new cut, haul route. At the bottom, a phrase was scrawled in block letters. You don't own the mountain. The signature line was blank. Merrick felt a cold thread slide down his spine. Someone had been inside this very hall. Someone close enough to watch the town's grief, close enough to leave a warning disguised as a message of morality. Bracken gave one low sound, not a bark, not a growl, but the kind of breath a dog makes when he recognizes a predator without needing to see its teeth. For a moment, the bright hall felt like a lantern in a myth, beautiful, brave, and surrounded by dark woods that listened back. Merrick didn't tear the flyer down. He photographed it, then handed it to Owen Klein when he and the agent arrived at the door a few minutes later, summoned by Tessa's quick radio call. Owen's jaw tightened as he read it. "This is good," he said, surprising Merrick. "Threats are evidence. People don't threaten what they're not worried about." The weeks that followed moved like late winter, slow, stubborn, full of hidden work. Warrants came through. The staging site was searched properly. Several men were detained for questioning, and 2 were arrested when equipment serial numbers tied back to previous illegal operations across county lines. The case didn't unfold like a movie. It unfolded like real life. Paperwork, interviews, long drives, measured statements. But the town felt the shift anyway, as if a weight had been lifted from the ridge. Merrick didn't become a celebrity. He became useful. Tessa asked him to join a volunteer program they built in the storm's aftermath. Ridge Watch, a community safety group trained to monitor snowpack risk, report suspicious activity, and organize evacuation drills. Merrick resisted at first, because he had spent years building a life where no one needed him. But one afternoon, when a grandmother named Delia Marquez showed up at his cabin with a tin of cinnamon rolls and a blunt expression, his defenses cracked. Delia was in her late 60s, short and sturdy, gray hair cut in a practical bob, skin weathered by mountain sun, and eyes bright with the kind of humor that doesn't ask permission. "I hear you're the man who listens to the wind," she said, pushing the tin toward him. "Well, my knees listen too, and they say spring will be late, so eat these before you become even grumpier." Merrick laughed, an actual quiet laugh that surprised him more than anyone. Bracken wagged once, as if pleased to witness proof that Merrick was still human. By the time the snow began to soften, the town organized something Merrick hadn't expected, a replanting day on the scarred slope. It wasn't grand, it wasn't performative. It was people showing up with gloves, shovels, and small saplings carried like fragile promises. Leah guided them on where to plant, explaining in simple terms how root systems could help stabilize soil, how living trees weren't decoration, they were infrastructure. Kids from the school placed seedlings carefully, tongues stuck out in concentration. Older men in worn jackets dug holes with the seriousness of prayer. Merrick arrived late, as usual, trying to stay on the edge. But Tessa handed him a sapling without ceremony. "Put it somewhere meaningful," she said. Her voice didn't plead. It trusted. He chose a spot near the edge of the cleared corridor, where the wind had once loaded snow like a weapon. He knelt, pushed the small tree into the earth, and packed the soil with careful hands. Bracken sat beside him, posture tall, ears up, watching the valley below. The dog looked like a sentry in an old tale. No magic, no prophecy, just loyalty given a job. Merrick felt something unfamiliar loosen in his chest. Not joy exactly, more like a door unlocking. When he stood, Carl Dempsey called out from across the slope, voice loud enough to carry. "Hey, Ridge Sentinel!" Carl grinned, and others laughed, and the nickname, half joke, half reverence, stuck like snow on a boot. Merrick shook his head, pretending annoyance, but the corners of his mouth lifted. The town didn't need a saint. It needed a watcher, a man who would notice the small crack before it became a roaring wall, a dog who could smell danger before humans could name it. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the planted saplings cast thin shadows over the snow, delicate as handwriting. Merrick looked down at Bracken, and Bracken looked back with steady, amber-brown eyes that held no judgment, only the simple, stubborn belief that staying matters. In that bright northern light, Merrick understood the story the mountain had forced them all to learn. Saving a town didn't require speeches. Sometimes it required silence, discipline, and the willingness to listen, first to the wind, then to each other. Sometimes the miracle isn't a thunderclap in the sky. Sometimes it is a warning that arrives like a quiet mercy. A change in the wind, a pause in a dog's step, a single person who chooses to listen when everyone else scrolls past the forecast. If God still speaks in this world, He often does it the way He always has, through small lights placed in ordinary hands, through instincts that protect, through neighbors who finally become us instead of them. In daily life, that same grace can look like calling your parents before it's too late, checking on the lonely house at the end of the road, telling the truth even when it costs you, or planting something good where fear once lived. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell where you're watching from, or the moment in your life when a small warning saved you. And if you want more stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances, subscribe to the channel and stay with us on this journey. May God bless you and your home, guard your steps, and send you the kind of quiet miracles that arrive right on time.